In this video, we'll talk about the politics of boom and bust, part 2, in the Chapter 32 review. Foreign policy flounderings were continuing to happen during the Coolidge era, and isolation continued to reign. The Senate would not allow America to adhere to the World Court, and Coolidge half-heartedly and unsuccessfully pursued further naval disarmament. Intervention in the Caribbean and Central America was continuing to be an issue. The troops were withdrawn after an 8-year stay from the Dominican Republic in 1924. They remained in Haiti until 1934. America was in Nicaragua intermittently since 1909, but Coolidge briefly removed the troops in 1925, but then sent them back in 1926, and they stayed there till 1933. Oil companies clamored for military expeditions to Mexico, but Coolidge resisted, and U.S.-Mexican tensions increased. International debts overshadowed all foreign policy problems in the 1920s as a result of the complicated tangle of private loans, Allied war debts, and German reparations payments. In 1914, the United States had been a debtor nation to the sum of $4 billion, but by 1922, they were a creditor nation to the sum of $16 billion. This figure shows the aspects of the financial merry-go-round from 1921 to 1933. American investors loaned $10 billion to foreigners in the 1920s, but most investments remained within the U.S. A key knot in the debt tangle was the $10 billion U.S. Treasury that the U.S. Treasury had loaned to the Allies during the war. The Allies had protested the United States' demand for repayment as unfair. The French and British stressed that they had suffered tremendous losses against the foe and that America should write off the loans as war costs. The borrowed dollars fueled the wartime boom in the U.S. economy, where nearly all Allied purchases had been made. And the final straw, protested the Europeans, was that the Americans' post-war tariffs made it almost impossible for Europeans to sell goods to earn dollars to pay back their debts. Allied debts affected the policy on reparations. The French and the British demanded $32 billion in reparation payments from Germany. They had hoped to use the money to settle the war debts with the United States, since the United States was demanding repayment. But as Germany suffered tremendous inflation, some Europeans proposed the debts and reparations be scaled back or even canceled, but Calvin Coolidge rejected any idea of debt cancellation. This is a picture of a German woman burning a near-worthless paper currency for cooking fuel in 1923, due to the hyperinflation in Germany. The Dawes Plan in 1924 was negotiated by Charles Dawes, who was about to be Coolidge's running mate. This rescheduled the German reparation payments and opened the way for more private American loans to Germany. A whole financial cycle became very much more complicated. U.S. bankers loaned money to Germany. Germany paid the reparations to France and Britain, and then the former Allies paid the war debts back to the United States. When the U.S. loans dried up after the crash of 1929, the jungle of international finance quickly turned to desert. President Herbert Hoover declared a 1-year moratorium in 1931, but most debtors were soon defaulting, except for honest little Finland, who struggled along making their payments until the last of their debt was discharged in 1976. The United States never did get its money, but harvested a bumper crop of ill will. So in the 1928 presidential race, Coolidge decided not to run, and Herbert Hoover became the Republican candidate, nominated on a platform of prosperity and prohibition. The Democrats nominated Alfred Smith, who was called Alcohol Smith, soakingly and drippingly wet, when the country was still devoted to the noble experiment of prohibition. He seemed to be abrasively urban, and he was also Roman Catholic, which some people did not like. The radio played a key role in the campaign for the first time and helped Hoover more than Smith. Hoover decried the un-American socialism and preached rugged individualism. Never having been elected to public office, he was very thin-skinned in the face of criticism and did not adapt to the give and take of political accommodation. The real power lay in his integrity. He was a humanitarian. He had a passion for assembling facts. He was efficient. He had a good talent for administration, and he had an ability to inspire loyalty in close associates who called him the chief. Hoover was the best business person's candidate. He was a self-made millionaire who recoiled from anything suggesting of socialism, paternalism, or planned economy. Yet as a Secretary of Commerce, he had exhibited some progressive instincts as well. He had endorsed labor unions, supported regulation of radio broadcasting industry, and had flirted with the idea of government-owned radio. This is a picture of Herbert Hoover on his whistle-stop campaign running for president. The indications of low-level campaigners became apparent in the forms of religious bigotry against Smith's Catholicism. The White House would become a branch of the Vatican with rum, Romanism, and ruin, is what they would say, and the South shied away from the city slicker in Al Smith. The election returns showed that Hoover triumphed in a landslide, winning both the popular vote and the electoral votes in a count of 444 to Smith's 87. This was a big Republican victory, and Hoover swept 5 former Confederate states and all the border states. This is map 331.2 showing the presidential election of 1928, showing that Hoover clearly won a majority of the electoral vote as well as the popular vote. Hoover's self-help responses to unorganized wage earners and disorganized farmers were important. In the Agricultural Marketing Act in June of 1929, he designed this to help farmers help themselves through producers' cooperatives. He set up the Federal Farm Board with a revolving fund of $500 million at its disposal, and the money could be lent to farm organizations who were seeking to buy, sell, and store agricultural surpluses that had happened as a result of the end of the war. In the 1930 Farm Board created the Grain Stabilization Corporation and Cotton Stabilization Corporation to bolster sagging prices by buying up surpluses. This was suffocated by an avalanche of farm produce as a result. Hoover, during the campaign, had promised to call Congress into session to bring about a limited change in the tariff. Unfortunately, the result was the Hawley-Smoot tariff in 1930, which was passed by both houses of Congress and turned out to be the highest protective tariff in the nation's peacetime history. The average duty on non-free goods was raised from 38.5% to nearly 60%, and to foreigners it was a blow below the trade belt. It seemed like it was a declaration of economic war on the entire world, and it reversed the promising worldwide trend toward reasonable tariffs. This plunged both America and other nations deeper into the depression that had already begun, and it increased the international financial chaos and forced the United States further into a bog of economic isolationism. And with this isolationism, both at home and abroad, this all played into the hands of the hate-filled German demagogue Adolf Hitler. The speculative bubble was about to end, but few people sensed that this was the permanent plateau of prosperity in the United States and that it would soon break. Prices on the stock exchange continued to spiral upward and created a fool's paradise of paper profits. A few people tried to sound warnings, but no one really listened. So the catastrophic crash came about in October 1929. It was partially caused by the British, who raised their interest rates, and foreign investors and domestic speculators who began to dump their insecurities. Tensions built to the panicky Black Tuesday of October 29, 1929. Shares of stocks were sold in a save who may scramble. Wall Street became the Wailing Wall as gloom and doom replaced the boom. Suicides increased alarmingly. Unbelievable losses in blue chip securities took place, and by the end of 1929, stockholders had lost $40 billion in paper values. You can see in this figure the index of common stock prices from the bull market to the crash, into the depression, into where FDR would be elected, and the eventual recovery as a result of the New Deal and preparations for World War II. The stock market collapse heralded a business depression, both at home and abroad, which would be the most prolonged and prostrating in the American world or the world experience. No other industrialized nation suffered so severe a setback. By the end of 1929, there were 4 million workers who were jobless. 2 years later, the figure had tripled. They were hungry and despairing. These workers pounded the pavements in search of work. Misery and gloom was incalculable, and over 5,000 banks collapsed in the first 3 years. The banks carried down with them the savings of tens of thousands of ordinary citizens. Pride goes before a fall. This is showing a curbside seller of the brand new Chrysler model that he had just paid for. Basically, he's selling as a result of the Depression. The countless thousands lost homes and farms to foreclosure. Bread lines formed, soup kitchens dispensed food. Families felt stress as jobless fathers nursed the guilt and shame at not being able to provide for their family. Breadless breadwinners blamed themselves for the plight, and mothers nursed fewer babies as the birth rate dropped substantially. This is a detail from California Industrial Scenes by John Langley Howard, 1934. This was depicting the Depression-era California and emphasizing the ethnic and racial diversity of the workers. What caused the Great Depression? Largely, it was an overproduction on both farm and factory. The Depression of the 1930s was one of abundance, not of want. It was the Great Glut, or the Plague of Plenty. The nation's ability to produce goods clearly outran its capacity to consume or pay for them. There was too much money going into the hands of the wealthy, who invested it in factories and other agencies of production. Not enough was going into salaries and wages to revitalize purchasing power. It was also a result of overexpansion, of credit, in particular installment plans, and overstimulated production, and new labor-saving technologies were causing unemployment. It was also a result of the economic anemia abroad. Britain and the continent never fully recovered from World War I. There was a chain reaction that caused a financial collapse in Europe, and international trade declined because of the tariffs. European uncertainties over reparations, war debts, and defaults on loans owed to America played a part, and many of these conditions were caused by Uncle Sam's narrow-visioned policies. It was also caused by nature. The drought-scorched Mississippi Valley in 1930 was an example, as thousands of homes and farms were sold at auction for taxes, and farm tenancy or rental, which was a species of peonage, spread among both whites and blacks. By the 1930s, the Depression had become a national calamity. Many citizens lost everything, and they wanted to work, but there was no work to do. America's uniqueness no longer seemed so unique, nor its manifest destiny so manifest. The Depression was a baffling wraith Americans could not grasp. The initiative and self-respect of Americans were stifled, and many slept in tin and paper shantytowns that were cynically called Hoovervilles. The foundations of America's social and political structure trembled. This is a picture of Hoovervilles in Seattle in 1934. Hoover's exalted reputation as wonder worker and efficiency engineer had crashed. He would have shone in prosperous Coolidge years, but the Great Depression proved to be beyond his engineering talents. He was distressed by the widespread misery, and as rugged individualist, he shrank from the heresy of government handouts. He wanted people to help themselves. This picture is called Feeding the Unemployed in the Early Depression, 1930. Convinced that industry, thrift, and self-reliance were virtues that made America great, he feared that the government doling out doles would weaken and perhaps destroy the national fiber, and that relief by local government agencies broke down as a result. So Hoover finally had to reluctantly turn from the doctrine of the log cabin individualism and accept a proposition that the welfare of people during a national catastrophe should be a direct concern of the national government. Hoover worked out a compromise between the old hands-off philosophy and soul-destroying direct dole being used in England. He would assist the hard-pressed railroads, banks, and rural credit corporations. If financial health was restored at the top of the economic pyramid, he felt that unemployment would be relieved and that the prosperity would trickle down. Partisan critics sneered at the great humanitarian. This is a picture, a political cartoon, basically about Herbert Hoover during the Depression era, and we'll discuss it in class. Most of the criticism of Hoover was unfair. His efforts probably prevented more serious collapse, and his expenditures for relief, revolutionary for the day, paved the path for the enormous federal outlays of his successor, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Hoover's trickle-down philosophy recommended that Congress vote immense sums for the use of public works, and it was secured from Congress appropriations totaling $2.25 billion for such projects. The most imposing of the public enterprises was the gigantic Hoover Dam on the Colorado River. This was a huge man-made lake for purposes of irrigation, flood control, and electric power. This was sternly fought, and basically Hoover continued to fight other examples of ways to help the economy, and ones especially that he thought were socialistic. Conspicuous was the Muscle Shoals Bill, which was designed to dam the Tennessee River. He vetoed this measure because he opposed government selling electricity in competition with private companies. In 1932, Congress responded to Hoover's appeal and established the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, or the RFC. This was to provide indirect relief by assisting insurance companies, banks, agricultural organizations, railroads, and even hard-pressed state and local governments. To preserve individual character, there were no loans given to American individuals. The pump priming loans, as they were called, helped, but the projects were largely self-liquidating. The government profited to the tune of many millions of dollars, and giant corporations also benefited, but it did not trickle down to the individual. So it was ironic that thrifty and individualistic Hoover actually sponsored projects with strong New Dealish flavors. The Norris-LaGuardia Anti-Injunction Act of 1932 was passed, which outlawed yellow dog anti-union contracts and forbade federal courts to issue injunctions to restrain strikes, boycotts, and peaceful picketing. Hoover did inaugurate a new policy, though, as well, and by the end of the term he had started down the road towards government assistance for needy citizens rather than just businesses, a road that Franklin Delano Roosevelt would travel much further. So Hoover's woes were increased by a hostile Congress. The Republican majority proved highly uncooperative, and in 1930 the Democrats gained control of the House and almost all of the Senate. The insurgent Republicans could and did combine with the Democrats to harass Hoover, and some of Hoover's troubles deliberately were manufactured by Congress. The veterans of World War I were very hard hit by the Depression, and if the Hawley-Smoot tariff was a bonus to industry, veterans wanted an early payment of their 1924 bonus that was scheduled to be paid in 1945. Many veterans were prepared to go to Washington. They were called the Bonus Army. They wanted to demand immediate payment of the entire bonus. They called themselves the Bonus Expeditionary Force, of some 20,000 who went to the Capitol in the summer of 1932 and erected shacks in the vacant lots, a gigantic Hooverville, and after Congress voted down the bonus bill, they were ordered to leave. Only 6,000 left, but then Hoover ordered the Army to remove the rest. This is a picture of the Bonus Army in Washington, D.C. in 1932. They wanted full payment of their promised bonuses, but they wanted them now. General Douglas MacArthur led the effort to oust the Bonus Army with bayonets and tear gas. He used far more force than Hoover had planned, and this brutal episode brought additional abuse on the once popular Hoover. This time was ripening for the Democratic Party, and for Franklin D. Roosevelt to cash in on Hoover's calamities. During this time period, Japanese militarists were attacking China as well, and the Depression increased international difficulties. Militaristic Japan stole the Far Eastern spotlight. In September 1931, the imperialists from Japan lunged into Manchuria. America had a strong sentimental stake in China, but few significant economic interests. But Americans were still stunned by the act of naked aggression. It was a flagrant violation of the League of Nations Covenant and other international agreements solemnly signed by Tokyo, not to mention the American sense of fair play. This is a picture, a political cartoon, showing the Japanese aggression in Manchuria, which lambasts them for disregarding the international treaty agreements when it seized Manchuria in 1931. Yet Washington rebuffed the League attempts to secure the U.S. cooperation in economic pressure on Japan. So Washington and Secretary of State Henry L. Stimson decided to fire only paper bullets. The so-called Stimson Doctrine in 1932 declared that the United States would not recognize any territorial acquisitions achieved by force. and they showed righteous indignation or a preach and run policy, which would only substitute for solid initiatives. This was a verbal slap, this verbal slap by the United States was not to deter Japan's militarists, and they bombed Shanghai in 1932, killing many civilians. There was no real sentiment for armed intervention among the depression-ridden Americans, who remained strongly isolationist during the 1930s. The collective security died, and World War II was born in 1931 in Manchuria. Relations with America's southern neighbors also changed during this time period, when Hoover became interested in the often troubled nations below the Rio Grande. After the stock market crash of 1929, the economic imperialism became less popular at home in the United States, and Hoover advocated international goodwill, and he strove to abandon the interventionist twist given by the Monroe Doctrine by Theodore Roosevelt when he had issued the Roosevelt Corollary. He negotiated with Haiti for the withdrawal of U.S. troops by 1934. In 1933, the last U.S. Marines left Nicaragua after an almost continuous stay of 20 years, and Hoover engineered the foundation stones of what was to be called the Good Neighbor policy. Upon them rose the imposing edifice under successor Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And this is the chronology from the chapter.